Moses had already done the impossible. He had stood before Pharaoh, watched the Red Sea open, and led Israel through a wilderness for decades. But now, near the end of his journey, one decision was about to change everything. And the strange part is this. Moses wasn't asked to perform some complicated miracle. God simply told him to speak. So why did Moses strike the rock? And why did that moment cost him the chance to enter the Promised Land? To understand it, we have to go back. Years earlier, Moses stood before Pharaoh with nothing but a staff and God's command. Pharaoh had an army and an empire. Moses had neither. Yet he demanded the freedom of God's people. And eventually, Israel left Egypt. Then came the Red Sea. The Israelites were trapped between the sea and Pharaoh's approaching army. But Moses raised his staff, and the impossible happened. The sea opened. Thousands of people crossed safely onto dry ground. But freedom from Egypt did not mean the end of Israel's problems. They entered the wilderness, and the journey continued. One camp became another, one difficult day became another. Years passed. Moses watched generations grow up around him while carrying the enormous responsibility of leading an entire nation. Then another crisis arrived. There was no water. The wilderness was dry. Clay jars were empty. Families were desperate. Children were thirsty. And once again, the people turned against Moses. They questioned why he had brought them into such a place. The crowd grew louder. Men argued. Families complained. Moses was surrounded by thousands of frustrated people. And the pressure on him was enormous. So Moses and Aaron stepped away from the crowd and went before God. They needed an answer. And God gave Moses a very specific instruction. Take the staff, gather the people, and speak to the rock. That's it. Speak. God did not tell Moses to strike the rock this time. That detail would soon become incredibly important. Moses took the staff and returned to the people. The massive rock stood before him. Thousands of Israelites gathered around it. Everyone was waiting. But the pressure hadn't disappeared. The people were still angry, and Moses was reaching the limit of his patience. He stood before the crowd and spoke harshly. He called them rebels. Then he questioned whether he and Aaron were supposed to bring water from the rock. His frustration was now visible, and then Moses raised his staff. The crowd watched. Aaron watched. Moses struck the rock. Once. But he didn't stop there. He struck it again. Twice. And then, water came rushing out. The impossible happened. The dry wilderness suddenly had water. Families rushed toward it. Children drank. People filled their jars. The animals drank too. From the outside, it looked like the problem had been solved. But Moses didn't know that the real problem had just begun, because God had not told him to strike the rock. God had told him to speak, and now God confronted Moses and Aaron. The issue wasn't simply the physical act of hitting a rock. God said they had failed to trust him and honor him as holy before the Israelites. That changes the way we see the entire scene. Moses wasn't just an exhausted man making a private mistake. He was the leader of God's people. Everyone was watching. His actions were representing God's authority, and in his anger, Moses had acted differently from the instruction he had received. But there is another detail that makes this story even more fascinating. Moses had seen something similar happen before. Earlier in Israel's journey, the people also needed water, and on that occasion, God told Moses to strike a rock. Moses obeyed. Water came out. Years later, however, the command was different. This time, Moses was told to speak, and Moses knew what had worked before. Perhaps that's part of what makes the moment so powerful. He was familiar with the previous miracle, but God was giving him a new instruction, and Moses did not follow it. Sometimes what worked yesterday isn't what God is asking you to do today. That's a lesson this story makes painfully clear. But Moses' problem wasn't simply familiarity. He was angry. He was tired. He had spent years dealing with the complaints and rebellion of Israel. And in that moment, his frustration took control. That's what makes Moses' failure so relatable, because most people understand what happens when pressure builds for too long. You can remain patient again and again. Then one final moment comes, and you react. Moses had followed God for decades. He knew God. He had witnessed extraordinary miracles. Yet even Moses could make a terrible decision when anger took control. And because Moses was a leader, his decision carried consequences. God told him that he would not lead Israel into the land he had promised. Imagine hearing those words after 40 years of wandering. Moses had spent decades moving toward that destination. Now he would see it, but he would not enter it. Eventually, Moses climbed Mount Nebo. From the mountain, he could look across toward the promised land. The wilderness was behind him. The land was before him. After all those years, the destination was finally visible. But Moses would not cross into it. That has to be one of the most painful moments in his entire story. Yet his failure did not erase everything that came before it. Moses had still been used by God in extraordinary ways. His life had mattered, his leadership had mattered, his faithfulness had mattered. But this story also reminds us that forgiveness does not always remove every consequence of a decision. And there is another lesson hidden inside the miracle itself. The water still came out. Think about that. Moses did not follow the instruction exactly as God had given it, yet the people still received water. That means the successful outcome did not prove that Moses' action was right. Sometimes something can work and still be done the wrong way. That's important because we often judge decisions by their results. Did it work? Did we succeed? Did everything turn out well? But God also cares about obedience. Did you trust him? Did you follow his instruction? Did you do what he actually asked? Moses got the water, but he had not obeyed the command, and that distinction changed his final journey. So what was the real problem? It wasn't simply the rock. It wasn't simply the staff. And it wasn't merely the fact that Moses struck it twice. The deeper issue was trust, obedience, and honoring God before the people. Moses allowed anger and frustration to influence a moment where God had given him a clear command. And that's why this story still speaks to us today. Because sometimes our greatest test doesn't come when everything is going well. It comes when we're tired, when we're frustrated, when people are pushing our patience, when we think we already know what to do. That's when listening matters most. Moses knew what God had done before, but God was asking him to obey what he was saying now. And that is the lesson. Don't allow yesterday's experience to replace today's obedience. Don't allow anger to make your decisions, and don't assume that because something worked before, God wants you to repeat it the same way. Moses stood before a rock. God gave him a simple instruction: speak. But Moses struck. The water came, the people drank, and yet Moses still faced the consequence. So the next time you're under pressure, remember this moment. Pause before you react. Listen before you assume. And when God gives you an instruction, don't replace it with your own method. Because Moses' story teaches us something unforgettable. The greatest test wasn't whether Moses could make water come from a rock. God could provide the water. The real test was whether Moses would trust God enough to obey. The miracle came from God, but the moment revealed Moses. And perhaps that's why this story has survived for thousands of years. Because the rock wasn't really the most important thing. The staff wasn't the most important thing. Even the water wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was the choice Moses made when he stood before that rock. One command, one moment, one decision, and a lesson that still speaks today. When God says speak, don't strike. When God says listen, don't assume. And when God gives you a command, obey. Because sometimes the greatest test isn't whether God can work through you. It's whether you will trust him enough to do it his way.